as he's sharing your heart, Jesus, and just let him be one in spirit and talk to every one of us here in Jesus' name. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Cool. Yeah, it's great to have you guys here. We're really excited about worship in LoveBristol, and literally the street behind is called Charles Street, and it's named after Charles Wesley, who lived on that street for a number of years. There's a little house there and that you can go and look at. So yeah, we're really excited to see you guys here. And thanks everyone else for coming. It's a bit of a damp day today, and do appreciate you guys coming out and being with us today. We've been talking a lot in the last few weeks about why we gather as community, and it is just really important to be in the same place at the same time, and just spend time in fellowship and worshiping together. So that's that. Basically, we have been, for those of you that have been here every week, the last few weeks, you'll have picked up that we've been following a theme of something called the Freedom Stream, which is kind of a 12-part course that originally Claire came up with on just a kind of a discipleship course and leading people into freedom. So we are on week 6 this week, which is forgiveness. Does anyone know or care to try and say what the other 5 are?
God is good.
Yes. You preached that one.
I am
Second one, third one.
I am significant.
Yeah.
Choose to trust.
Find a place with God. Private space.
Yes, your secret place with God. Yeah.
I'll let God work on my character.
Yeah. Great. And the last one. That was it.
That's the last one.
Cool. Is that 5?
No, we've missed one out.
Yeah. Which was the one we missed out?
Trust.
No, it said trust.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, goodness, trust, significance, quiet place, and then, yeah, hang on a second.
Good. Well done, Amy. It's good to have a teacher in the house. Cool. So, I'm speaking on forgiveness, and the passage that I'm speaking on today is the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18. So I'm just going to start by reading that out. Most of you can see that. It's oh, I better press that.
No, I pressed it.
Cool. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wants to settle accounts with his servant. He goes on to say this parable. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wants to settle accounts with his servant. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children, all that he had to be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, cancelled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could repay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I cancelled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. And Jesus said, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. That's quite a strong old message, isn't it? And, Jesus in this particular parable really does not mince his words. And I think in some respects, we're not that used to used to hearing it that full on from God, but it's there, so we're going to speak on it. And I just wanted to highlight 3 things that stuck out to me from this parable and this passage. And the first thing, maybe flick back up to the first slide on that. Yeah. The first thing is about the nature of God. And it's obvious from that passage that God wants to reconcile himself to us. And obviously for us, that's not just a kind of a now thing, that's a reconciliation that goes into eternity. And I think that's a core message in this one. There's like 3 things I want to highlight. And that's one of the core things in this passage. And I think we often get to our place when we're thinking about God, is God just really, one of my kids said to me once a couple of years ago, is God just really attention seeking? He wants us to worship him, and is he just really an attention seeker? I think that was probably out of slight jealousy of attention that he was getting versus attention they were getting. But that was the thing levied at him. And that is definitely not what is going on with God. God is not begging for our likes. He is basically, he's happy, content, at peace. He's not in need. He's not starved of attention. He's not some sort of extrovert in deficit. We're not, also, the other thing is we're not trying to reconcile with God. This reconciliation isn't because we're trying to appease some sort of needy God, and again you can get your head into that space. I think really we need to acknowledge who God is, and there is a significant difference between humanity and God, and in this offer from God or forgiveness or reconciliation, he wants us to have a relationship with him, and to have a relationship with him requires something to bridge the gap. From God who is perfect and unblemished, versus us with all our brokenness and our faults, and grace and mercy is what is needed to bridge that gap. And in some ways, forgiveness is the kind of the vehicle that God uses to do it, but it's the grace and mercy that is required. And that came through Jesus. The act of Jesus' death and resurrection was this costly act that was to overcome our separation from God, and it's what allows his forgiveness to flow, if you like, towards us. If you're here today and you haven't encountered that grace, maybe it is a moment for you to consider that and embrace this forgiveness. There's absolutely nothing, it says in the Bible, there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. There's no deed too dirty, no crime too complicated. We just need to acknowledge that we cannot make it right on our own. And if you've ever been part of AA, it's this thing of the 5th step is this thing of speaking. We confess our flaws, and we know that we acknowledge we need a higher power. So from that we come from exile into his presence. And this is an act from God that's as inclusive as it gets. There's no one that is beyond this reconciliation. Everybody is welcome to it. But as I said, at the heart of it, this forgiveness is grace and mercy. It's gifted from God, and that's really what makes it more than just just words, like an exchange of words or whatever. Is this grace and mercy is something of substance that actually does something, and that's really worth bearing in mind. Just a little quote on grace. So I found this quote from a Methodist preacher. It says, "Grace binds you with far stronger cords than the cords of duty or obligation can bind you. Grace is free, but once you take it, you're bound forever to the giver and bound to catch the spirit of the giver. Like produces like. Grace makes you gracious. The giver makes you give. And I think that really kind of expresses really well what goes on in that transaction with God. The second thing that I want to highlight is that forgiveness of others is obligatory for a disciple of Jesus. It is not optional. And obviously in the passage, sorry, getting back to that, it's fairly obvious. There's a definition of forgiveness that I looked up, and I'll read it out. Might be there. Yes. Yeah, in this, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines forgiveness as to cease to feel resentment against an offender or to give up resentment or claim to requital. And requital means kind of revenge or redress. And I want to ask the question, if we know that's forgiveness is obligatory, what is hard about forgiving? Why don't we all just forgive really easily? And what is it for us here that actually, why do we find it hard to forgive sometimes? Maybe we don't all the time, but why sometimes do we find it hard to forgive?
Well, we lose out, because that guy lost out on 100 gold coins.
Okay, you might lose out. Next.
I want justice.
Justice, in the pursuit of justice, yeah.
The sense of superiority
In what way?
over the person that you aren't willing to give forgiveness to.
Right. If you hold on to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Good one. Anyone else? James?
Feel like you might get walked over.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So they might take advantage, or being taken advantage of you. Yeah. That's good.
It's not fair, but we need to forgive.
Yeah. That's kind of injustice.
Sometimes wounds are very deep and need to be healed, and sometimes there needs to be an acknowledgement that something's done wrong to somebody.
Yeah.
So that's sometimes the forgiveness you can say it in your mouth, I forgive you, but really you have not really forgiven the person who is saying it at face value, that the wounds are deep, and you need to be healed first sometimes
Yeah.
before you get to that place of forgiveness.
Yeah, so that's a really good question around forgiveness or point is that the role of the other person in that process of forgiveness. What is their role? And is there a role for the other person in there? Do you always have to have it acknowledged, or can you forgive without it being acknowledged? I want to read a little story to you. There's a guy called Shane Claiborne who is a friend of LoveBristol. He's been there a couple of times, not for a few years, maybe 3 or 4 years, but he has been a few times. And he's written a book about called Executing Grace, which is about the trying to abolish the death penalty in the States. Something we unfortunately don't have here. But he's battling, and in the process of writing this book, he's been around the country talking to people about their stories, and this is just one story that he's written. And I just want to read it out to us. So it's a story of two mothers. It's called Moving from Death to Life. On February the 12th, 1993, Mary Johnson's only son was murdered. He was only 20 years old. Devastated beyond words, filled with rage, even hatred, Mary was paralysed with the anguish of it all. The perpetrator was 16-year-old O'Shea Israel, who eventually received a 25-year sentence for second-degree murder. But something spectacular, one might even venture to call miraculous, happened. Mary was reading a poem entitled Two Mothers, which to this day she only knows to be written by Anonymous. And she says apparently has written lots of great hits. The poem is about two angelic figures meeting in the heavens. As they meet on the streets of gold, they can tell by the stars in each other's crowns that they were both mothers on earth. And they can also tell by their blue-tinted halos that they have both known the deep sorrow and despair of losing their sons. As they describe their boys to each other with deep joy and motherly affection, the one mother realizes she is talking with Mary, the blessed mother of Jesus. Mary describes the cruel death of her son, but Mary raises her back up, kisses her on the cheek, wipes away her tears and says, "Tell me the name of the son you love so." The other mother, looking straight into her eyes, says, "He was Judas Iscariot. I am his mother." When Mary is confused, there's a couple of Marys in here, Mary, the mother of the boy that was murdered, read that poem, she was moved, compelled to meet with O'Shea, the murderer of her son. Eventually his mother, and the healing began. At first she met O'Shea, she laid it all out there. "You don't know me and I don't know you. You didn't know my son and he didn't know you." So we need to lay a foundation to get to know one another. They talked for hours. O'Shea couldn't believe Mary could forgive him. The power of that forgiveness beyond words. He asked her for a hug and she hugged him. Mary knows the power of her story and she knows how scandalous it seems to our unforgiving world. When he left the room, she says she cried in disbelief. "I've just hugged the man that killed my son." As she got up, she felt her soul began to heal. Years later, in March 2010, O'Shea was released after 17 years in prison, and Mary threw him a welcome home party. In fact, they ended up living next door to each other in Minneapolis. As he returned home, O'Shea said he was blessed to have two mums. Those two mums now claim each other as sisters and share the role of motherhood to O'Shea. Mary Johnson went on to start an organisation called From Death to Life to support mums who have lost their children and for mums whose children were responsible for taking life. And Shane says, "When I went to Minneapolis, I stayed in the house where they all meet, a holy little place called St. Jane House, with photos of reconciliation and healing plastered all over the walls. And Mary came over for dinner. She explained that now they have two support groups that meet regularly each month, the mums whose kids were killed and the mums whose kids have killed. And both groups meet together whenever they can. They know all too well their healing is bound up together. They need each other." As Mary hugged me with a warm, contagious smile, I thought to myself with a profound awe, these same courageous arms embraced the man who killed his son. I felt like I'd been hugged by an angel with blue-tinted halo. And it's an amazing story, isn't it? A really moving story. And I know when I first read it, it brought me to tears. I think the impact of forgiveness, as it says in the story, is it can be real bitterness and resentment. And in some ways, when we forgive someone, we release that person. That's what we're doing. We're releasing them from the debt and the reprisal. And I think as well, at this point, it's important to say what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and it's not the same as trusting. Those are two very different things. You need to rebuild trust with someone, and you can't just forget what's happened even when you've forgiven somebody. And as we're talking about this stuff, possibly for some of us in the room, events and people pop into our minds as we're thinking about this thing of forgiveness. And maybe for some of us today is the time when we need to actually say, yes, I don't want this to grow in my life. I don't want this bitterness or resentment to grow in my life, and I don't want to hold on to this unforgiveness. I want to deal with it. And I think I want to give us an opportunity to do that, whether it's in the course of this or with each other afterwards. So definitely don't let that moment go. I think also it's well known that unforgiveness really impacts our mental health. And if we hold on to unforgiveness, it can lead to a really significant impact on our mental health. And even physically, I remember a few years ago we were doing a healing morning and praying for someone who had, I think it was stomach pain that she had, and I just felt prompted to ask that when this pain had started in her body, And she said, is there anything significant that happened? And she had said, yes, there was this car accident or someone had driven into her, and she was really angry with the person that had done it. And just we went through a prayer of forgiveness for that person at that moment, and then prayed for their healing, and they were healed straight away. And sometimes that unforgiveness can really lead to trapping us into some physical ailment. And I think for me, forgiveness is about becoming empowered to release someone, and then what you're doing is you're handing over the judgment of that person to God. It's kind of an act of our will, and it allows then God to bring healing, like it did to that lady, that the healing can start. But it is a core bit of our discipleship, and we should all be attempting to keep a short account with people over things that crop up. The third thing I wanted to highlight is that at the bottom of the passage, it says that our forgiveness needs to come from the heart. And at the start of that verse, Peter asked Jesus, how many times must I forgive someone? And I think the convention at the time was 3, based on God's activities in the book of Amos, where he was forgiving 3 times but not 4. And so I think Peter maybe was pitching for 7, like good wholesome Hebrew number, and probably thought he was doing quite well. And then Jesus just multiplies it, 7 times 70, and kind of like too many times to count. And I think the big question for many of us that have been Christians for a little while is, how do we keep forgiveness alive and in our hearts? How do we keep that fresh and warm towards people, and not just get fatigued? And I think a couple of people alighted on injustice. There is this sense of injustice. There's injustice, you're looking around the world. There's institutional injustice that we've become aware of in the last couple of years, really come up again. And then there's crazy dictators doing awful things to people around the world. And how do we keep forgiveness prevalent in our hearts when all that stuff's going on? Even in our friends and family, we're probably all aware of people that consistently act selfishly, sort of try to take advantage of us or treat us unfairly. And how do we keep that flow of grace and mercy towards people? And I think, we've probably got some people in our lives where that sort of ebb and flow of grace and mercy comes back and forth, and it seems to be working quite well. And there's probably other people where there's just this sort of bank balance that always appears to be in the negative. How in those situations, how do we keep going? And I think the key to it is tracing back the gesture all the way back through, and that gesture started with God, and God initiated it towards us. So that grace and mercy comes out of that act of God towards us, and then it can carry on flowing. And so the source has to be our worship. So when we worship, what's going on is we're becoming more and more like what we worship. So that's why God was so on it with idols, because basically whatever we make an idol of in our life is what we become like. And anything that gets in the way of our worship to God is an idol, and actually distracts us away from becoming more and more Christ-like. And so the key has to be that relationship and worship with God, and how you actually access that, what that looks like for each person in terms of spending time and developing that relationship will be a little bit different. But we need to be people that spend time in the presence of God. And without that, I really don't think having a heart that is light because you're not carrying that stuff is possible. I just don't think it's possible. So I think I want us to be a community that's able to forgive easily. That's what I want the reputation to be of LoveBristol, and has a significant capacity to forgive, more than the ordinary. And more than the average person. Like, you know, that story that we've read is extraordinary, of that lady and the level of forgiveness that she was operating. You know, Christ modeled to us on the cross, whilst he was dying, he was able to forgive the people that had put him on the cross. You know, so how are we going to set our lives up to do that? I think it means addressing things that when someone's talking to you in a room like this, you've all got your own thoughts going on. Some of you are thinking about a lunch, and some of you are thinking about what I'm saying. Probably a random mix of all of it. But in moments like this, God's giving us an opportunity to address stuff that actually we're carrying, and actually seizing that moment, not letting it go, is really important. So grabbing someone before you leave and saying, look, I don't know why, but I've just been prompted to thinking about this, and I want to sort it out. I don't want to carry it out the door with me. I want to leave it here and walk out freer than when I came in. So for some of us, and it might only be a few of us, there will be things that we've just said, yeah, I do need to sort that out. And I really encourage you to do that. For others of us, or for all of us probably, we can make this declaration of the sort of person that we want to be, and the sort of community that we want to do. And there's something powerful in saying something together. So what I'd really like us to do is say this declaration together. Maybe all jump up and let's say it. Is that okay? Yeah? Cool. So again, as Claire likes to say, this isn't the Bible. This is just a declaration, but it's a good one. So let's start. All together. I will be a forgiving person. I will operate a culture of grace in and around my life. I will value unity above being proved right. I am willing to set my will to forgive others and myself, whatever the circumstances. I understand that grace both covers my failures and shortcomings, and also empowers me to change. And I will offer the same to all who hurt or offend me. I will practice not taking offence, thinking the best of people, and honouring those who think differently. I understand that if I withhold grace, I prevent God from working freely within me, and so I will seek to bless even those that persecute me. Amen. I'm just going to pray. Lord, thank you for this declaration. Thank you that you first initiated grace and mercy towards us, and that we are forgiven. And I just pray for every person here that they will get the full measure of that freedom, Lord. We want to be a people that are known for our forgiveness, known for our grace, known for our mercy. And I just pray for each person here that will encourage each other to more of that, Lord. In your name, amen.